This is the second, maybe third or fourth time I've been to this particular sanctuary, and you do my heart great. Every time I come here, I hear words that just resound in my head and my heart. When you quote Marion White Edelman, when you quote Martin Luther King Jr., when you quote in the past Frederick Douglass, I know I'm at home because this is my life. This is how I came up through the civil rights movement in Mississippi. And when John asked me to come to speak to you today, we kicked around a few topics and a few ideas about what I would talk about, and we landed on racism in the United States of America. How did we get here? How did we get here? That's both a rhetorical question and one that begs for an answer. This morning I want to offer an answer by tracing a series of historical and contemporary events that reveal the enduring power of America's number one original sin, racism. As I describe these events, I trust that you will begin to discern the connective tissue that binds them all together. And if not, I will make those connections explicit, but I think you will see them for yourselves. To answer the question, how did we get here, we must begin at the beginning. We must travel back to 1619, when the first enslaved Africans were brought to Hampton, Virginia, aboard a Dutch ship named the White Lion. Crammed into the hulls of slave ships crossing the Atlantic Ocean during what is known as the Middle Passage, they were brought here to the British colonies, not as tourists or vacationers, but as free labor for wealthy owners of cotton, tobacco, and sugarcane plantations. Because of centuries of unpaid labor in these industries, plantation owners accumulated immense wealth. In my home state of Mississippi, for example, the city of Natchez once had more millionaires per capita than any city in the country. Wealth derived from the sale of cotton and the zero labor costs that produced it. Contributing to that wealth was the fact that Natchez was also home to the second largest domestic slave trade in the Deep South. Enslaved Africans were treated as chattel to be sold, bought, traded, and even forcefully bred with other enslaved Africans and white plantation owners and their surrogates to produce more enslaved human beings. Let's move forward a couple of centuries. The United States fought a bloody civil war over the issue of slavery. More than 500,000 people died over the question of whether the economic and social benefits of enslaving human beings was morally defensible. The Confederate States of America said yes, and ended up on the losing side of the war and on the wrong side of history. On January 1st, 1863, Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring that the era of enslavement was coming to an end. 2 years later, the war ended, and the federal government launched the Reconstruction era. Prior to Reconstruction, we know that black people could not vote, had no recognized rights, and no legal standing as human beings. Reconstruction changed that. It enabled black Americans to own property, to vote, and to run for public office. As a result, black families acquired homes, land, and businesses, and more than 2,000 black officials were elected at the local, state, and federal levels. Reconstruction, if nothing else, was an attempt to create a more perfect union, as promised in the preamble of the U.S. Constitution. But efforts to do so were met with immediate and violent backlash from white segregationists and white supremacists in the South. Here we see one of the earliest and clearest examples of the formation of that connective tissue. White backlash rooted in the fear that any gains of black people constituted a loss for white people, the old zero-sum game. With a wink and a nod from the federal government, Southern lawmakers embarked on a new and more intense acts of resistance, one of which was the creation of the Black Codes, or Jim Crow laws. The overarching purpose of the Black Codes was simple: to restore the racial and economic hierarchy that existed prior to Reconstruction. For example, the Black Codes prohibited black people from buying land, serving on juries, voting, testifying against white people, or marrying outside of their race. Unemployment was criminalized, leading to mass arrests in which black people were forced to work for white employers in order to pay their fines. That practice continued for decades, in which minor offenses were elevated to felonies, punishable by forced labor. Also, children could be taken from their parents who were deemed indigent and legally forced into unpaid labor for white households, which was another form of enslavement. The black codes were brutally effective. By 1877, Reconstruction had collapsed. Although efforts to maintain newly acquired rights continued, the Supreme Court in Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896 put an end to those efforts when it ruled that states could maintain racially separate public facilities for black and white people as long as those facilities were equal. The effects of that ruling was that systemic racism received what I call a booster shot of steroids, which immunized them from legal challenges for the next 60 years. Now let's move forward again to the 20th century, where violent white backlash intensified. During the Red Summer of 1919, so aptly named for the massive loss of blood of hundreds of black Americans, including returning World War I veterans who were murdered or viciously attacked by white mobs for simply being black. While many of these atrocities occurred in the South, racial violence also erupted in such places as Washington, D.C., Chicago, and Philadelphia. In 1921, there was the Tulsa Massacre, where hundreds of black residents were killed and the prosperous black community known as Black Wall Street was destroyed. Why? Because black economic success was perceived as a threat to the white way of life. In 1923, in Rosewood, Florida, more than 30 black people were murdered by white mobs for similar reasons. And during the same period, southern states and communities began erecting Confederate monuments and statues. Those statues and monuments were not built primarily to honor Confederate history, but also as symbols of intimidation and oppression. They literally served as concrete reminders to black Americans that the racist and violent spirit of the Confederacy was still alive. Let's move forward again to 1944, when Congress passed the GI Bill of Rights, which provided low-interest loans and grants to returning World War II veterans to purchase homes, to start a business, or pay for college, all resulting in the creation of a strong and vibrant middle class in this country. But guess what? More than 1 million black veterans were denied those benefits. Southern politicians pressured the federal government to allow states and local governments to administer the GI Bill, thus ensuring that black home ownership, business ownership, and higher education would be systematically blocked. Again, because these potential financial gains by black veterans were seen as threats to the white Southern way of life. Let's move forward 10 years to 1954 in the Brown decision, when the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the doctrine of separate but equal was unconstitutional. Public schools can no longer operate dual school systems, one for white children and one for black children. The backlash to the Brown decision was immediate. Many school districts repealed their compulsory school attendance laws, with the message being that it's better that children receive no education at all than attend desegregated schools. Also, white flight from the public schools led to the establishment of all-white private schools. In Mississippi, the state legislature created what was called the Mississippi Sovereignty Commission, whose explicit purpose was to block integration by any means necessary. In 1956, the Southern Manifesto was signed by 19 U.S. senators and 77 members of the U.S. House of Representatives as a document declaring their opposition to the Brown decision. And let's move forward again, a year after the Brown decision. The murder of Emmett Till and the start of the Montgomery bus boycott ignited the modern civil rights movement across the South, in which I was a proud participant. a movement that forced the federal government to create two landmark pieces of legislation, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The history of the civil rights movement reveals a protracted clash between a resistance movement that stood for justice and equality and a resistance movement that stood for hate and white supremacy. One of the legacies of the clash of these two resistance movements was and continues to be that white supremacists perceived advances in civil rights and social justice as existential threats. In his inauguration speech in 1963, Alabama Governor George Wallace proudly proclaimed, "Segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever." Wallace's defiant proclamation became the mantra for thousands of white segregationists all across the South as they intensified their resistance to integration. Resistance to racial justice and equality were also evident in horrendous acts of violence, which dramatically escalated in the 1960s. And it included, among others, the murders of Jimmy Lee Jackson, Medgar Evers, Vernon Dahmer, Michael Schwerner, James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, Viola Liuzzo, and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. In fact, from 1882 to 1968, over 4,000 black people were lynched in this country because of the color of their skin. Moving forward to 1968, 3 years after the passage of the Voting Rights Act, in a well-calculated backlash to the Voting Rights Act, Richard Nixon implemented what was called the White Southern Strategy, deliberately courting disaffected white voters who felt threatened by emerging black political power in the South. Over the ensuing decades, this strategy reshaped Southern politics. Today, most state governments in the South are dominated by white conservative Republicans due to Nixon's very successful white Southern strategy. Let's move forward once again to what some call Jim Crow 2.0. When it emerged, a black man was elected president of the United States, and resistance and backlash exploded in the form of flourishing hate groups such as the Tea Party, the Proud Boys, and the Patriot Front. President Barack Obama endured relentless racist attacks over his citizenship and his education, attacks fueled and amplified by the racist rhetoric of Donald J. Trump. The First Lady was vilified by racist media pundits and politicians. For example, you might recall that a West Virginia nonprofit director and the town's mayor in their Facebook post called Michelle Obama an ape in heels. Also in 2016, Trump's campaign co-chair Carl Palladino said, "I'd like her," meaning Michelle Obama, "to return to being a male and let loose in the outback of Zimbabwe, where she lives comfortably in a cave with Maxie the gorilla." No other president or first lady have ever had to put up with such brazen disrespect. Also, this Jim Crow 2.0 period saw the gutting of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. In the 2015 Shelby case, the U.S. Supreme Court removed the requirement that Southern states must have any changes in their voting laws approved by the U.S. Department of Justice. What followed was the enactment of a rash of voter suppression, voter subversion, and punitive voter ID laws, not only in the South, but also in other parts of the country. And if the SAVE Act, which some of you are familiar with, if the SAVE Act passes, that trend is going to continue, more voter suppression. Let's move forward again tonight to 2020 and the murder of George Floyd. In that time, we witnessed an unprecedented global outpouring of grief, outrage, and solidarity. Across the world, people marched in support of racial justice and for the beloved community that Dr. King had envisioned. Sincere efforts were made to bring about reasonable police reforms. And the state of Mississippi even changed its state's flag, eliminating the Confederate flag as a feature of its official state flag. For a minute, it appeared that the winds of change were starting to blow in the direction of justice and unity. But for many, even these calls for justice and unity were perceived as threats. In response, efforts emerged to ban the teaching of critical race theory, often by people who didn't even know what critical race theory was. Anti-DEI laws spread across the southern states. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis proudly proclaimed that Florida is where DEI comes to die. Books were banned. College professors were censored or fired. History itself became a battleground, and the justification for eliminating or sanitizing certain historical facts was that learning them would cause psychological impairment of white kids. And part of the backlash became rhetorical, when right-wing politicians and pundits weaponized the term woke and began using it as a derisive term for anyone who embraces social justice. But I have to tell you, when they call me woke, I proudly wear that descriptor. I am proud to be woke. I want to ask them, what is the opposite of being woke? What is the opposite? What is it about DEI that you don't like? What is it about diversity that you don't like? What is it about equity you don't like? What is it about inclusion you don't like? But it all comes from the same place, from a place of white supremacy. Jim Crow took even deeper roots with the election of Donald Trump in 2024. I will always believe that Kamala Harris lost primarily because of her gender and her race. A majority of voters in this country simply could not accept a black woman being president of the United States of America. Upon taking office in 2025, Trump dismantled diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives through executive orders, eliminating offices, defunding programs, banning trainings, and pressuring contractors to abandon their own equity practices. Even the language used to describe racist violence was sanitized. The Trump administration recently forced the U.S. Park Service to remove language from a brochure that described Medgar Evers' assassin, Byron De La Beckwith, as a racist. The list goes on, including Trump's recent video depicting President Obama and Mrs. Obama as apes. How we got here can be viewed through the lens of documentable historical evidence that shows a clear and unbroken line from 1619 to the present, a through line that reveals the connective tissue between historical and contemporary white supremacy. That connective issue is fear. Fear among some that white Americans are losing power and their privileged status. When someone has enjoyed the benefits and advantages of white privilege for so long, any efforts to bring about equity and equality are reflexively viewed as threats that can trigger anxiety and the development of a persecution complex. And J.D. Vance attempted to assuage that anxiety of some white Americans when he proudly proclaimed at the Turning Point USA rally this past December when he said, quote, "We no longer have to apologize for being white anymore," close quote. And my question to Mr. Vance is, when did you ever apologize for being white? When did you ever do that? Besides, no one is even asking for an apology for being white. We just want you to stop these racist policies that are triggered by your racist philosophies, your unmerited sense of entitlement, and by your efforts to control the zero-sum game. If they win, we must be losing. A former white high-ranking official of the Texas Annual Conference of the United Methodist Church captured this irrational and illogical fear when he said publicly these words: "Black people need to understand that white people feel threatened because white people believe they are losing power and status." Now to say high-ranking, he was a bishop. He was a bishop in the United Methodist Church. But here's the inconvenient truth that he chose to ignore. The inconvenient truth is that white Americans continue to dominate the American political and economic landscapes, controlling all three branches of government, the majority of governorships, the majority of state legislatures, the majority of heads of media and entertainment empires, the majority of college presidencies, and the majority of executives of Fortune 500 companies. There is no loss of power, only a loss of total, unchallenged domination. And I'm convinced that this UMC official, United Methodist Church official, was speaking not only for himself, I believe he was also speaking for a sizable portion of this nation, which further explains how we got here. How we got here is obvious, but where we go from here isn't so obvious. Also, what is obvious is that the struggle for social justice continues, and the resistance to it continues. The purveyors of hatred and bigotry, the white Christian nationalists, the white supremacists, the Islamophobes, the homophobes, the transphobes, and misogynists will remain relentless in pursuit of their goal of establishing a race and gender-based theocratic dictatorship. But for the rest of us, we must continue the struggle, even when it might seem hopeless and exhausting. When I start to feel that way, I draw comfort and hope from two of my heroes. First, Dr. King reminded us that we must engage in not only the fights that we think we can win, but also in those fights that we don't think that we can win. He stressed that staying silent or refusing to engage in difficult, unwinnable battles is a failure of moral courage. Another source of comfort and hope for me comes from Mahatma Gandhi, who shared his thoughts regarding tyrants when he said, "When I despair, I remember that all through history, the way of truth and love have always won. There have been tyrants and murderers, and for a time, they can seem invincible. But in the end, they always fall." Think of it, always. So when we ask, how did we get here? The answer is painfully clear. We arrived here through centuries of fear. Fear that equality would mean loss. Fear that justice would mean accountability. Fear that sharing power would mean surrendering privilege. But fear has never been the author of progress. Courage has. Truth has. Love has. And as I said earlier, after answering the question of how we got here, the remaining question is, where will we choose to go from here? The forces of hatred and bigotry are relentless, but they are not invincible. In response, we must be undergirded by the words of Dr. King and Mahatma Gandhi, to have moral courage to fight the unwinnable fight, to dream the impossible dream, and to know that tyrants always fall, always. As we continue to engage in the struggle for social justice, we must remain unbowed and unafraid. We must resist, we must speak, we must march, we must teach, we must pray, we must love, we must vote, and we must stay woke. The challenges of the moment and the memories and legacies of those who sacrificed so much in the past demand from each of us a commitment to do no less.